name's Brett. I'm an alcoholic. So for those of you that don't know me, I may seem like kind of quiet, but don't worry, I'll get worked up in a minute. For those of you that know me, you already know that. So this is basically security. We're doing it wrong. And there's some funny pictures here. My favorite's the lower left-hand corner. That's antivirus. And then this guy's a gangster. Anyway, okay, so cool. So yeah, I'm basically going to go, man, those lights are really bright. I'm going to go on a rant, basically, and start talking about why we're doing security the wrong way. Give a bunch of examples, a lot of data to support what I'm saying, and then it's kind of more of a conversational thing. So if you disagree with me, let's talk about it, and we'll see what's going on. So who the hell am I? My name is Brett. I'm the CEO of Source Ninja. We basically do open source management, so we make sure that you aren't running code that's outdated. The guy that talked before me, Rand, he actually talks about handling that stuff in the cloud, and that's pretty much what we do. So I was previously a penetration tester. I've been a developer. I authored a book called Hacking the Next Generation. The next one we're writing is Hacking Enterprise, and then Deep Space Nine is following that. And then I'm also good looking. So what are we doing wrong? If you start thinking about security and you start thinking about all of the problems that we have today, they're not new. They've been around for a long periods of time. The majority of these problems come down to input validation and buffer overflows or input validation, cross-site scripting, that's argumentative, but SQL injection, et cetera, et cetera. So the first question to ask yourself is InfoSec a science or an art, right? I've been on phone calls with PCI Council. Maybe I should admit this, whatever. I've been on phone calls with PCI Council when we went through an ASD test, which is basically all the people that are PCI certified scanners, you got to go through this big test. And at the very end of the test, while we were on the phone with this guy, the guy goes, well, this isn't an exact science. I'm pretty sure it is a science, but that's okay. So I'm going to make the assumption that it is a science, and so therefore we should be using things like scientific method. We should also be measuring, which we love to use the term security metrics, but most people don't understand what that is. It's like, yeah, we understand we're going to measure something. Well, you either need to improve it or decrease something, et cetera, et cetera. And then also hypothesizing. And when you hypothesize, you should actually state what I'm about to say is my complete opinion. There's some data that supports it. It could be wrong, right? And then the one thing that really irritates me is whenever I read any document that's data supported and they use soft language. So they'll say, oh, often, most of the time. Most vulnerabilities out there. It's like, dude, stop saying that. Like, that you're just throwing in added gibberish that doesn't need to be there. All right, so rule one, don't offer opinion. If you can't draw conclusions, don't guess, get more data. That's a pretty standard science thing, right? It's like, well, crap, what my hypothesis was, the data doesn't support my hypothesis, I'm going to re-hypothesize, I'm going to try to get some new data sets, I'm going to go with it. The problem that we really have in the security community is understanding root cause. We don't care about root cause. And I'll get into some principles that you can actually get into to understand what root cause is that Toyota developed like 100 years ago. But on the surface, whenever you say something like, oh yeah, there's a security vulnerability, well, how did the security vulnerability get in there? Oh, well, this guy did this or so on and so forth. It's like, oh, okay, that's good. It's like you're not understanding the root cause. So the first thing I'm going to pick on is the Verizon data breach report. How many people read that or have read it? Awesome, a lot of people. Does anybody work for Verizon in the room? Awesome. So, just checking. So my favorite part, so I have the 2010 and I have the 2011, the 2012 isn't released yet. But in the 2010, there's a nice comment where they actually say, there wasn't a single confirmed intrusion that exploited a patchable vulnerability. I want you to think about that for a second, and then I want you to think about the security programs that you guys have, and you basically can completely get ready for vulnerability management tools. You don't even need to use them, because there's clearly no data that supports that that's how they're compromising systems. So I know that everybody in the room just kind of had a gut shift where they're like, no, that doesn't feel right at all, right? And that's basically that's your security guy coming out going, something is wrong with that data. So they have I know there's somebody that works for Verizon in the room, they just didn't want to admit it. So there's also a second part where they actually say, based on evidence collected over the last 6 years, Verizon wonders if we're going about security programs in the most efficient and effective manner, which is basically, tell them hi for me, whatever the, basically whatever the overarching concept is, right? That totally made me lose my train of thought. There it goes. Yeah. So basically, they even state exactly what I said. Well, if that's the case, then maybe we're going about security programs the wrong way. Now, here's a screenshot from the actual section. So for those of you not familiar with the report, it basically breaks down two kind of core concepts. It breaks down data breaches, and it breaks down how much important stuff was actually pulled, how many records were pulled from certain attacks. So that's what the red number is, and the left is the actual data breach. So out of 38% of data breaches, which is 86% of the information that was pulled in total. So this is in the section that's entitled hacking. There's also a section entitled malware. And so in the hacking thing, you can see here these are the top three. It's use of stolen login credentials, exploitation of a backdoor or command control channel, and SQL injection. So the first two things there, I would actually go into an argument of saying that that's actually exploiting patchable things, right? Use of stolen login credentials. Well, how did they get those login credentials? And Verizon states they got it through malware. Okay, well, let's ask the next question. How did the malware get on the system? And oh, well, it just appeared. And so that's what I mean by we're not taking enough steps to actually understand what the root cause is. So here's the next section of the report where it actually breaks down some terms. So they actually say, there's a soft language I was talking about using the word often. So the malware infection vector is installation or injection by a remote attacker. This is often accomplished through SQL injection or after the attacker has root access on the system. Okay? And that's 51% of cases. So let's just say it's even. Let's say that some of that SQL injection, which is obviously going to be, well, most likely it's custom code, which can't be patched. And then they also have the other section that's basically, they already have root access on the system. It's like, well, how did they get that root access? Well, that's explained through malware. And then they break that down and they say, drive-by downloads, auto-executed drive-by downloads, was 19% of the cases. So those are all infecting zero-day vulnerabilities, like every one of those. And they obviously don't go into that because their logs are hard to find, etc. And then they also have 9% that are user-executed. So you send a message and they're like, okay, click, which they actually do separate from phishing attacks. So there's somebody goes to a website and 4chan, and basically it pops up and says, do you want to run this code? And they go, yes, I do. And then it's popped it. So not only do we have soft language here, but we also have these core concepts that says, although they go back here and they actually say there wasn't a single confirmation of intrusion of an exploitable patchable vulnerability, that's kind of not the case when you start actually breaking down and looking at the data. So that's rule 1. Rule 2, find the root cause. So this is the second point of it. So if you can't draw conclusions, don't guess, get more data, understand that root cause. It's kind of the same concept, right? So let's look at the 2011 data breach. So in there, they actually state that there's 5 CVEs that have been exploited to gain and deal with breach and pilfer information. And so in the report, they actually say hackers prefer other vectors or organizations are patching well. Most likely, it's a little of both. Again, soft language, most likely. Okay, so you're taking the concept that basically hackers prefer other vectors or organizations are patching well. Well, some of those CVEs say 2007. I don't know if I would draw the conclusion that organizations are patching well if certain organizations are getting compromised by that. But basically, because there's only these 5 CVEs, that's what it boils down to. For those of you that are familiar with the attacker space, you know that attackers are just like everybody else. They're going to use path of least resistance, right? And so if they have stolen credentials or they have a way to get drive-by malware on there, yeah, of course they're not going to go out and start hacking systems. That just doesn't make any sense. There's easier ways to go about it. They do, point that out. But if you just look at the dates, it's kind of concerning, to say the least. They also state, I have a big blob of data here. They also state that we continue to maintain that patching strategies should focus on coverage and consistency rather than raw speed, blah, 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 blah. Okay? All right, so it's been 10 minutes in, so now you guys all need to relax your brains for a second. So, is this anybody's first BSides? Hey, there's a lot of people. Holy crap, there's like 80% of the room. Awesome. You guys do Pilates? Okay, just checking. Pro tip, don't come to a conclusion where data supports the opposite. So, one of the things about the Verizon data, they give all numbers. It's awesome. Like they do give a lot of data there. It's just a problem of the conclusions that are drawn. The other thing is it's only this will be the 4th year that the Verizon data report came out. If you guys know anything about statistical data, 4 pieces of data is not good to support any type of conclusion. So anyway, that's that. So let's look at some breaches that happened, and let's see if the data that we have supports the Verizon data. Here's the CEO of Heartland. He said, 13 pieces of malware capitalized on weaknesses in Microsoft software infiltrated one or more of our network servers. Okay, that wasn't a guessing password thing. They actually exploited some piece of known code. How about this one? This is Gene Spafford, who's very spiffy looking in his tie. Makes him authoritative. So he spoke in front of the he did congressional testimony, and he said, Sony was running outdated and obsolete software on the PlayStation and online entertainment networks, leaving the systems extremely vulnerable to the kind of attack that subsequently led to the breach of over 100 million customer records. Okay, so we have two now cases which are fairly large. I'm pretty sure they're actually the two largest of how the data was compromised. I couldn't find a picture of Lee Morgan, who is he's actually a journalist, and I actually sent him an email and said, hey, could I get a picture? And he's like, I don't have one online. I was like, okay, whatever. So basically, he stated they simply logged on to part of a group site reserved for credit card customers and substituted their account numbers, which appeared in a browser address bar, with other numbers. So basically, when you go to your website, right, it says account number 12345. They'd do 12346 and push enter, and be like, oh, hey, there's more customer data. So that was the root cause of the city hack. Again, extremely complicated attacks these guys are using, right? Okay. By the way, I kind of do this thing, so that's my Twitter thingamajigger. And if you have a question, just tweet it, and as I talk, I can do it. If you want to interrupt me, that's fine too. Okay, vulnerability management. So first off, and this is not VMs, this is vulnerability managers. Vulnerability managers are not to be used to identify assets. Okay, I talk to people all the time where they're like, oh, I found a bunch of servers I didn't even know I had. It's like, okay, you clearly have bigger problems than just getting a VM. So who uses vulnerability managers on a daily basis or weekly basis? 6 people. Okay. I would think that there would be more, but okay. Anytime you ever read a comparative analysis on VMs, they always break down into 2 things. It's false positive rates and false negative rates. And if you work with VMs all day long, you understand this is the biggest pain that you suffer all day long, because the whole cycle is, I'm going to scan a bunch of stuff, I'm then going to get a ton of false positives back, I'm going to go through those and see if any of those are actually either exploitable or if they actually even exist. And the biggest problem is with backporting, which I'll get into in a second. The third thing with application, if you do application VMs, the big thing there is that the spidering ability actually dictates how good the scanner is. There's been work by Mike Shima that talks about this and other players. The fourth thing that's interesting about a VM is aid-in remediation. I'm going to go to a definition of what a vulnerability manager actually does, and it's kind of interesting to read what things they actually are supposed to do versus what they do. When you think of the word management, you would think all of the management associated with vulnerability. So that would mean things like assignment to a responsible party, aid in mitigation, et cetera, et cetera. So how do we reduce false positives from a vulnerability manager? Well, we can do authenticated scans, which I'm sure all of you that have VMs want to do that because it just makes your life a little bit easier. And then they also have backported fixes, which is a huge issue. So for those of you that don't know, Red Hat, Debian, name any Linux distro that you use, they actually do what's called backported fixing. So when there is a vulnerability that's reported in SSL, and they say, okay, and SSL actually fixes it, the way that you would fix this in old school ways is you would actually download the new binary, download the new source, you'd recompile, and you're good to go. The problem with doing that is that they sneak security patches in with other things, and so when you do that, you may be using an API that they deprecate, and so therefore it breaks your system. So to get around that, what Red Hat and Debian and all these other players do is they backport the fix. So they'll actually take the snippet of code that's the security line, and they'll copy and paste that into what they have, and then they'll recompile that and they push that out as binaries. The reason this is interesting is because the way that VMs actually do scanning is that they, in authenticated scanning and non-authenticated scanning, they ask the server, what version are you running? And the server comes back and says, I'm running 1337 of Apache. And then it goes and looks in a lookup table and goes, 1337 is 5 years old. And it goes, oh, you're clearly out of date. And so then, you get that on your desk that some dude ran a VM scan. You now need to explain why you're running a 3-year-old or 5-year-old outdated version of Apache. What it actually boils down to is that they don't change the version number, they just do a revision number, because that's essentially when they forked the code base and started backporting all the fixes in. Well, that doesn't help you if you're trying to use a VM to actually identify vulnerabilities, which is kind of, I don't know if that's a clear definition of what a vulnerability manager should do, is identify vulnerabilities, but it seems like it. So what makes a good VM? So on Wikipedia, there's a huge article about it, and I actually looked at the history because I wanted to see who contributed, to if I knew any of them. But there's essentially 4 things that a good VM is supposed to do. So they're supposed to do vulnerability discovery. I would pretty much argue that all of them do that. They have high false positives, high false negatives, but they do VM discovery. The next is classification. So some of that is kind of interesting because a lot of the VMs had to start doing classification because of regulatory compliances. So with PCI specifically, there's some rules in there that basically say if you have a vulnerability that's a CVSS of 4.0 or greater, then you're not PCI compliant, which is actually kind of BS, because if you read the subs text, it says this excluding things that are availability bugs. So you can basically be completely DOSable and you're still PCI compliant because you're not pilfering data, right? So if you start thinking about other things with classification, though, is like things like unique prioritization. Do you actually have the ability in your vulnerability manager to say, this is actually a more severe bug for us personally than it would be for anyone else, so we want to update this, right? We want to make this a height a 10, or make her backwards, this is a level 1, right? So most of the things that I've seen, they don't have the ability to do that. Third thing, remediation. So do VMs actually help with the remediation process? Like typically they'll be like, yeah, you're running Apache 1337, update to the newest version of Apache. Well, if you're running Red Hat, that clearly is not going to help you at all, right? You're like, oh, okay, I'm going to go download and make source. I'm going to pop that in. So remediation is kind of, I would say that they do give some tips, but not for the whole. The fourth is mitigation. So mitigation, with the way that it's defined, is finding the root cause of the problem and addressing it, right? And if anybody works for a VM and they want to come tell me about how they actually do that, I would love to hear it, but just that doesn't support it. So clearly vulnerability management isn't helping. That's a huge step that I just made, so hopefully you guys caught my little joke there. How do you find root causes of problems? So this is a methodology that the guy that used to run Toyota back in the 30s, what he said. So when they did things on the line, they would actually ask 5 whys. So the first thing would be like, the vehicle won't start. That's the problem. So of course, as a good manager, you go, why? And then they would say, the battery's dead. Now, in security land, that's where we stop. We just go, great, replace the battery, let's move on, right? Well, that's an issue. Like, and everybody in this room should really understand that that is an issue. So then you go, okay, well, you ask again, so the battery's dead, why? Well, the alternator's not functioning. Okay, that's still good, we're getting a little bit more data, so that's the second why. Third why, so why is the alternator not functioning? Well, the alternator belt's broken. Okay, well, we're doing better because replacing the battery obviously wouldn't address the root cause, and therefore we could just keep replacing batteries. Now in security land, we love doing that, right? We're like, oh, we patched it. Cool, hey, there's a new vulnerability, let's patch it. Let's just keep patching, right? I love patching, it's awesome. So then you say, okay, the alternator belt is broken, why is that? Well, the alternator belt was well beyond its useful service life and not replaced. Okay, well, we're clearly getting a little bit more information, so why is that? Well, the vehicle was not maintained according to the recommended service schedule. Perfect. So now we actually have the root reason, right? The root reason isn't the battery just happened to fail. The root reason is that the person didn't service the car, right? And so we can kind of use the same mentality with vulnerabilities and security in general, is that when you actually get in a room and you start trying to understand these root causes, just keep getting to why. Pretty sooner or later, it's going to be the developers are stupid. That's the reason why, right? Now, we love saying that because it makes us feel like we're God's gift, okay? So we love saying, oh, it's a developer's problem and it's their responsibility to fix it and blah, 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 blah. And so there's been a lot of things dealing with security programs of let's educate developers. So at my last gig that I had, that was actually my task. So we can have a long conversation about that if you want. Audience participation. So who has a security program? Actually, let's ask it the other way. Who doesn't have a security program? Booyah! That's funny. I actually saw some people that raised their hands that work for security companies. I'm not pointing you out. Does it consist of running so those of you that do have a security program, is there anybody that their security program doesn't actually they're not responsible for running a VM? Anyone? Okay. So if that's the case, we have this concept right now where then it's like, okay, well, let's run a VM. So who also hires pen testers? Okay, quite a bit. Okay. So I'll come back around to the pen test thing in a second. So rule 3, stop trying to solve impossible problems. There was the last talk that was in here, there was a couple of times when they said, this is a problem we're looking to solve, right? I want you guys to all understand that if you're in security, you will never solve a security problem. Like you'll figure something out, you'll patch it, but you're not going to solve the problem of like security is going to go away, okay? It's just not going to be there. So if you take that into classic developer land and you start thinking about, okay, well, what's that, what's a good metaphor for that? I would think of like P versus NP, right? We're basically trying to solve P versus NP as security people, and there's people that are like, yeah, I'm sure that sometime you may figure it out, but we, again, going back to the God's gift, right? We kind of have this mentality of, we can solve it, we're smart, we'll figure it out. So one issue is that security programs are too complex. My best example is who actually uses the Microsoft SDLC, or is their program based on SDLC? Wow. Oh, okay. Oh, there we go. If you read the SDLC documentation, my favorite part, so they give like, there's like 9 different things and work it into the development cycle and blah, 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 blah. And then when you get to towards the end, they go, every single one of these steps is optional. I hate to tell you, but if you give that to somebody and they go and they look at it, they're going to go, let's implement this, and they just give it to you. None of that is going to actually sit down. Thank you for turning off the lights. None of that's actually going to sit down, and they're not going to say, this is a piece that actually we can directly, this will help us, right? We can use this, let's do that. And then if you do implement a security program, are you actually measuring things, right? That's one of the hardest pieces in security is, and in general, is when you want to do something, what do you actually measure, right? It's pretty simple. If I cut a board, let's measure the length, measure twice, cut once, right? But in security land, we kind of go, okay, how many vulnerabilities do we have open? 15, cool, let's close those. Hey, how many do we have now? We have 1, sweet, we did good, right? It's like, well, again, the root causality, all that stuff, you didn't solve anything. Also, remember, vulnerabilities will always exist. I'm sick of hearing about like technologies, and there's a huge conference going on like over there where they sell products that solve security issues. And you basically just plug one of these things in, you don't have any security problems ever again, right? Now, to you and I, we kind of laugh about that, but I'm not kidding you. There's people over there right now making purchasing decisions that's what they think that's going to happen. They think that they're going to buy a box, they're going to give it to the security team, and then with that money, they do it. And the way you can tell this is because after you do it and nothing has changed or you've only made a small reduction in stuff, they'll come to you and say, well, I bought that box for you. It was $250,000. What did we spend the money for? Right? And it looks bad if you actually say, well, that was your purchasing decision, not mine. They don't like that. Pro tip. So here's a true story. I'm old enough to remember whenever the argument, and it's still used pretty much, the term hacker, right? You guys remember getting arguments, those of you that are older like me, just kind of everybody in the room, I think. So do you guys remember having conversations about what a hacker actually is? You always get in like fights about it. You'd be like, no, that's not, hacker is about like modifying technology to do something it's not originally intended supposed to do, right? And then we'd still read like media journals where it's like, hackers broke into blah, blah, blah. And we'd be like, I'm so angry. I'm going to keep ranting about this. So as security people, we thought that was kind of almost a solvable thing. Like we thought, hey, if I tell enough people about this, they will adopt that as a practice and they will go ahead and start doing it, right? Now, if you really start thinking about this, you know who actually solved this problem is developers, and specifically Facebook, when they started saying things like, oh, well, we use the hacker mentality. Oh, what's that? You guys break into computer systems? No. Here's what the hacker mentality is, and then everybody's like, oh, hacker mentality, that's what a hacker is, and all security people are like, shh, we've been doing that we've been trying to solve that for years. That clearly doesn't work. All right, quick check. Do your developers code securely? Didn't you guys teach them anything? I mean, come on, like, you've been working your company a while, right? Like, teach them to code securely. It's not hard, right? There's like huge programs dedicated to this stuff. So there's a great developer conference that happened, and The guy gets on stage and starts talking about developers and security, and starts talking about, do your developers actually write good code, right? And so he said, how many people think that they write good code? A bunch of people raise their hands, right? He goes, okay, great. He goes, I'm going to ask you a question. Say that you were going to get on an airplane, and you were going to fly from Los Angeles to New York. If your development team wrote the software that that plane ran on, would you feel comfortable flying in that plane? Everybody's hand went down. Now, what scares me the most is I'm sure Boeing was in that room. They're like, Dave, don't you work for Boeing? Don't worry about that. So, that's kind of somebody to think about. And when you get on a plane next time, realize that the guy that was the product manager for that plane, he probably thought the same thing, right? All right, so what this boils down to is incentives, okay? Developers are not incented to code securely. That's not what they're doing. And it's our responsibility to actually make sure that their code is secure, right? If you do not have something like partner programming or code review, just even from another developer, a security person doesn't have to look at it, but think about it from a security standpoint when they do it, you're losing the battle. Like, that's definitely something that's needed. If you think about what developers are incented for, they're incented to push out new features so that the sales guys can sell more product. That's it. And in fact, if you really start thinking about it, think about your individual company. How are you incented? You're typically incented by what the sales cycles look like. How much money is the company bringing? Okay, I'm going to get back to that in a second. You guys start thinking about how do I incent them to do that? Okay. So security programs are not mature. We all love to say, oh, I have a security program. Really? How long? Oh, 4 years. Man, we have great metrics, like everything's coming out. I got this cool dashboard, like I bought it, and it shows me these lines that go down. So something is clearly working. So first off, realize security is always an afterthought. And the way you can really start thinking about this is think of how many people have become wealthy by doing a startup. They were the first security engineer at that startup. Facebook just made a lot of people rich, or will make a lot of people rich, I guess. I can tell you that there may be one security guy, and that's a fluke, okay? Get used to it. Like, security is always an afterthought. You will never go into a company, and to some extent that's actually good for us because it's job security, right? Here's the Metasploit example. If I can compromise your systems with Metasploit, you do not have a security program. I don't care like what you do. Your Metasploit's using vulnerabilities that are known about, you're not patching that stuff. Okay. I heard the last guy that presented Rand said, I was required to put a cat photo in there. And I laughed, I was like, check. So, APTs. So I'm sure that I don't have to go on a huge rant about APTs because everybody in this room, I'm sure, has a feeling about what it is. So first off, the term advanced. Okay. Does anybody originally know where APT came from? That's right. Well, you kind of. It's a military term that is specifically reserved for state-sponsored attacks, right? So that's why China got mentioned. Anytime somebody says APT, by the way, RSA, that was an APT attack. I guarantee you. Huh?
That's a round.
That's a round?
Yeah. That's a drinking word.
What, APT?
That's another round.
APT, APT, APT. I don't see anybody lifting drinks up. It is past noon, so. Big day. Cloud stuff. But the last talk would have made me really messed up. Here's the thing that really frustrates me about APT. If you start thinking about what APT is, okay, great. APT is, in the classic sense of the word, it's a state-sponsored attack. Let's throw that out and just say it's a supremely advanced attack that I would probably wager maybe one person in this room could probably pull off. Like, that's an actual APT, okay? The problem is when you start reading the data of what people are saying, they're like, oh, it's an APT attack. I'm like, really? So what did they do? Oh, we got a phishing email, and there was like a link to that to a 0-day vuln. That's an APT attack? Like, no, that's not an APT attack, okay? So the best part about the term APT, and the reason you see it all the time, is because it's the best excuse ever. Think about it, right? If the real reason you got breached is because your vulnerability program, you're like, well, we ran scanning stuff against it, and it didn't detect anything, and you're like, oh, okay, well, what about that server? Oh, that one's really vulnerable, but don't worry about that. APT, that's what caused it, right? It's a very, very easy get out. And you're gonna see more and more and more and more of this stuff. The other interesting thing about APT attacks, if you look at the cycle of who actually detects them, they're typically security companies. they're not incentivized to like make you fear anything, right? All right, so let's talk a little bit about threats and then what they're addressed by. So this is kind of very security program 101. I'm trying to get things down to like the root dogma. I think it was like Calvin or somebody, and like try to take all the religions and then boil all down to dogma, right? So I'm trying to do that same thing. So there's basically 3 threats, right? You have known threats, you have unknown threats, you have custom threats. So a known threat is that there's a vulnerability out there that exists. All of us can go to NVD, we type in the CVE, and it'll give us some data. Maybe we go over to Packet Storm Security, we download the exploit, and keep hitting it, right? Okay, great. Those are known things. Security programs should definitely address those. That's something that your security program should just address. Second thing is unknowns attacks, right? So these are like 0 days, et cetera, et cetera. So mitigating technology should kind of prevent the majority of those. Now realize, again, you're never going to solve everything, so there's going to get some stuff that's going to get through. There's a bunch of vendors out there. If you go look at there's one here that's sponsored. If you go look at their data sheet, it actually says prevent 0 days. Leave you guys to figure out how they do that. It's magic. The third thing is custom. So this is actually stuff where when you think of classic penetration testing, so I'm an ex-pen tester. I do not classify myself as a pen tester the way that I look at people that are pen testers, right? I go, if you can sit there and you start looking at servers, and let's say that there's nothing that's available to you that's known, and there's only unknown stuff, can you actually sit there and break into that computer? And if you can, then you are actually a pen tester. Like that's, in my opinion, what an actual penetration tester does. So the first thing is we need to identify vulnerabilities, et cetera, et cetera. So kind of gone through that already. Make sure nobody's pinged me yet. Hey! Oh, these are just quotes. Just make sure nobody... Oh, wait, there's a question. At Big Dead Comp, somebody's going like, screw you, Brett. At Big Dev Comp, someone asked if your dev team wrote code for air... Oh, sorry, that's just a quote. Okay, let's move on. I'm never going to be able to get you guys through that now. Okay, so if you want to... oh, I totally skipped it. Yeah, penetration testing. Okay, so penetration testing, first off, is not a security process. Okay? If you hire a pen tester and they only work a week, they're not doing much. Okay, they're going to find some known threats. They're going to write it up in a pretty report, and they're going to give you a deliverable, and they're going to charge you $37,000 for it. Okay, penetration testing should only be used after having a security process. If you are not running like a vulnerability manager or some type of vulnerability discovery tool, and if you do that and it still is finding things, then you shouldn't hire a pen tester. Like you need to get back down to that thing, and you need to figure out how do we tighten this up, how do we prevent this stuff before we go hire a pen tester to do it. And the other thing too is when you do that, the penetration tester, you're going to get the most bang for your buck, because they're not going to find low-hanging fruit and they're going to be like, oh, I'm in San Francisco, I'm going to go get crunk, right? They're going to actually sit there and they're going to have to work at it. There's nothing worse than being on an engagement where you can't find anything. You start looking at little things like, oh, you didn't set that cookie set secure. That's really high vulnerability. Let me explain why. I used to actually joke that you can always tell a good pen tester by how many low findings they actually have. Because the low findings is always stuff they know and they just have it in their back pocket. They're just like, yeah, I didn't find anything today. I actually did. You set secure cookies, SSL, blah, 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 blah. So if you disagree with me and you start saying, oh, penetration testing, no, it's part of our security process, I want you to think, how much of the threat surface does a penetration tester actually cover? Let's say the pen tester works for an entire month, right? Is it 50%? Are they covering 25% of your surface? I think it's probably below 1%, right? They're going to identify stuff, they're going to go after it, they're going to do some clever Google searching to try to find something. They're not going to write custom code for you. And if they do, again, it's still at the 1% level, okay? All right, so interesting. So there is, I'm going to start up now, right? So it's the company down there. So there's this interesting concept called the lean principle that this guy named Eric Rice wrote. And I think security is one of those sciences where we can actually learn a lot from other different, thank you. I was about to say vertical. We can learn from these other verticals. Other disciplines, thanks. So basically, the lean principle is this concept of build something very, very small, and it's called a minimal viable product, right? What's the smallest thing that you can actually sell to somebody that they are willing to pay for? And identify that, and then just sell the crap out of it, right? And the way that you do this is that you do something, you measure it, and then you kind of iterate, and you keep doing that. The reason this is so interesting is that a friend of mine has a very successful startup. And what he did is to actually validate the idea. He had a page, just a splash page, that said blah, 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 blah. This is what the product does, right? In like one sentence. It said sign up, or pricing, right? See pricing. When you clicked it, it brought you to a page that said, oh, you came a little early, enter your email address, right? And the reason why is Eric Rice actually has this concept that says the minimal viable product is much more minimal than you actually think it is. So his concept was, I'm not even going to build anything, I'm just going to test this theory, right? So he got like 300 signups from that. He's like, okay. He goes, okay, well, there's kind of a demand. Now let me see if people are willing to pay for it. So what he did is he actually stuck a page in the middle, and he said, somebody was calling me, stuck a page in the middle and said, when you clicked pricing and sign up, the next page that popped up said, what plan do you want? Free plan, $15 a month, $30 a month, $99 a month, right? When you click that, it would go, oh, too early. Please enter your email address, right? But if you think about what he's doing, right, he's taking these small iterating steps and he's figuring out exactly what people need. And so what he figured out is that just from that little test, he figured out that 5% of people that actually came to the page would be willing to pay for it, right? So he can easily figure this out. He's like, okay, 5%. If I get 1,000 signups, then I have 50 people and 50 people paying $20, blah, 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 and he just breaks it out, right? And so he goes, okay, well now it's worth building a little product. So he builds a little product, pushes it out there, and then just keeps going, right? So security, we can learn from this. Okay, this lean principle of minimal viable product. So like, what's your minimal viable security offering, right? So the first thing you have to understand is you have to understand what to measure. And this is probably the hardest thing. So in startup land, it's kind of easy because it's like, okay, signups, right? Then he figured out signups and he goes, okay, well, I'm changing my measurement now to people who are willing to pay, right? Security, we need to do the same thing. We need to identify something to measure. Maybe it's maybe the first step is just how many vulnerabilities does a vulnerability scanner find, and how can we reduce that number? Okay, so then you figure out what you want to measure, you measure it, and then you do some stuff, and then you check your metric. You say, okay, and then did it improve, right? Did it increase or decrease? Whatever your hypothesis was, what would happen? If the answer is yes, great, continue doing stuff, right? What you're doing is clearly working, so let's keep doing stuff, right? If it doesn't work, then you have the wrong metric, right? You need to do something else. You need to figure out some other metric that you can actually measure. So basically, fail fast, iterate fast. These are concepts that the startup community has, and I think that we should adopt them as security people. And this is not like, oh, I'm going to take 6 months to do this. It's like, in a week, see if you can actually reduce something, right? If it's by 5 or 6 volumes, whatever. So when coming up with a security process, take very, very small steps, right? Maybe the first step is just code review, right? See if just by doing that, does Sensic or some other web application scanner identify stuff, right? Can you reduce your VMs? Security is cultural, and unfortunately, that is completely, it's very different from what I was saying about you're never going to get a security guy very early on at a company, right? If you think about that, well, if you don't have a security guy, then you can't have cultural security, right? Because there's nobody from the beginning saying, we need to make sure we have unit tests. We need to make sure we have integration tests. We need to make sure we have security in place. There is none of that. So by the time the security guy gets there, it's very hard to redefine the culture around you, right? Around security. 3A, don't teach developers security, okay? We've been saying for a long time, we need to teach developers how to code securely. That does not work. Go measure it. I'm telling you, your developers are not coding any more securely than they were before you got there, okay? And if they are, they're doing it to juke the stats. Those who watch The Wire know what I'm talking about. Don't juke the stats. Okay, okay. Here's a very simple thing. Blank developers make blank products. Security developers make secure products. I don't know very many secure developers, okay? But kick-ass developers make kick-ass products, right? This is very, very simple. So just kind of take that and go with it. All right, rule 4. Don't pretend you're something you're not. That goes back to God's gift, right? There's God's gift over there. So don't pretend you're something you're not. So we love to basically say like, oh, I'm solving these problems, I'm doing all this stuff, right? So don't get frustrated. So 62% of financial services industry thinks that time to market and the need to release products with shorter development cycles was their #1 issue. That came from Coverity, right? Coverity's entire job is to basically like make sure that there's not problems in code, okay? If that's what financial services company who basically get breached like all day long, just go to like data loss DB, like, right? Understand security is a cost center. It's very, very hard for us to identify what metric explains why we need to be there, right? The only way that they can do it is go, well, We had a $4 billion data breach. How much do we spend on security? Well, we spent $130 million. Okay, so now security has cost me $4.13 billion. So the simple exercise you can use is that if you have these people on your team, who would be the first one to get fired? That's the fastest way to figure out whether you're a cost center or whether you actually create revenue. So security increases expenses, developers increase profits, executives increase profits, sales increase profits, business development increase profits. If somebody wants to argue with me why security has increased profits, I'd love to hear it. You're not. Oh, there's one guy that raised his hand.
Developers cost money.
They do cost money, but it's very easy to correlate what they cost versus what the impact they can do. The fastest thing, if you actually want to figure this out, just start a startup, and you'll be like, I need to spend $150,000 in a developer. Am I going to be able to get more than $150,000 in sales from hiring this person? The answer is pretty much yes. So that's it. I have 9 minutes left for questions. So, are there any? I was debating on whether I should just not present, and we could all take naps after lunch. My next talk will be nappy time. Sorry?
Should have brought a cooler full of beer for us.
Yeah, I have a hard time with that kind of stuff because I don't know when to stop.
What are the action items?
Yeah, what are the action items? So there's basically 3 takeaways. So the first is that hopefully you'll go back and actually look at your security process and understand what parts of it you can cut out. Like, if there's something that actually is process, and that's really all it is, you need to remove it, right? The second thing, what are you measuring? Like, if you have a security process, the first thing in that security process should be, these are the 3 things we're measuring, right? We're measuring this, this, and this. It also should not be 50 items. It needs to be something very simple. In startup land, there's one measurement, right? Facebook, for instance, the only thing that they measure is daily users. Like, how many people come back on a daily basis? And that's the only thing they care about. So anything that will drive people to go back more on a daily basis, they will do, right? So you need to kind of find your key metrics that you need to use, and that's, unfortunately, I can't give you what those are because that's very unique to each organization. So that's 1, 2, 3 is vulnerability scanners suck. As a vulnerability scanner? So the question is there anything that I like as a vulnerability scanner? I think the vulnerability scanners, the initial thought of them whenever people developed them, I think that they had very good reasons as to why they wanted to do it, right? Identify vulnerabilities, that sounds great, right? At some point, though, what ends up happening is they lose that startup mentality, right, which is kind of pleasing the customer. They don't care anymore. They just, once they start getting a certain amount of profits in the door, then it's basically just, how do we scale this out, right? They don't need to do anything. And the reason that that's justified is whenever I asked, how many of you guys use vulnerability scanners or vulnerability management tools? Everybody uses a vulnerability management tool, right? So they clearly have a huge amount of money that they can make from you guys, and you guys will still buy it even if they suck. It doesn't matter. You guys will still buy it. Yeah.
It's a good partnership as mentality. So and partially because the PMs oversell themselves and they don't preach. Policy will have their.
You shouldn't mention names, but go ahead.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Well, they have a framework that they're supposed to follow. Most companies don't do that. They'll buy the product, stick it in, they'll do after network, and then they'll do a full scans. And then they stop there. They run the reports, take back to the ops team to go get patches to servers instead of actually following the framework. So a company that makes a product is a piece, is a pie. But if you unless you are willing to take on that whole pie, then yeah, I agree. Then why bother with the subs?
The problem is that even if you implement the framework that any of them suggest, it's, again, we're going back to the process, it's almost too much overhead, right? Because if the majority of my day and those that actually do this as a daily basis, how much of your time is actually sitting there figuring out what's false positive? Yeah, it's a huge portion of your time is wasted to that. So even if there is a very, very good framework, the majority of your time is just sitting there doing essentially what the VM should be handling a lot for you. Now the argument from the VM standpoint is that, well, we'd rather have false positives than false negatives. I think that's an easy cop-out.
And breaking the system is the other thing you can't do. So an easy way to do this is to actually execute the following. But I think a lot of people in this room probably can print that out and take it for while running this against multiple stuff.
But
right?
so yeah, so the question is or what the statement was is that most people would actually run the vuln if they could. What do you think penetration testers do?
Well, okay, depends on the pen tester and what they're supposed to be doing. Well, and it depends on how low lying your fruit are. Like you said, some pen testers, you know, the worst thing that happens to pen testers is they don't find anything, right? So if you're on Metasploit, you're looking at known vulnerabilities, right? So that's low hanging fruit right away. A good pen tester is probably going after passwords, going after an account.
But counts are still extremely low hanging fruit.
Oh my goodness.
And the other thing about a penetration tester, if you guys are hiring penetration testers, it depends. Like what he said about well, hiring the penetration tester depends on what the penetration tester you're hiring is. If they're not penetrating, then they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing, right? I'm sure there's some clever sexual metaphor that I could use here, but I'm not going to.
Didn't you say that pen testers for school was on the before you called you pen tester using the app?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, oh no. I think that penetration testers should definitely be used, but I think that a lot of companies actually use penetration testers way too early. They don't have a very basic security policy in place before they actually hire a penetration tester.
That's what I'm saying. You're saying the app suck, but you should use it.
Yeah,
Seatbelt suck.
that's right. See, you. Oh yeah, seatbelt, like a seatbelt could kill you. Like there are reported accidents where it's like, if he wasn't wearing a seatbelt, he would survive. So therefore, I'm not wearing my seatbelt. Yes, you're totally right. But in 80% or 80+% of cases, if you're not wearing your seatbelt, you're gonna go through the windshield. Yeah.
So, you said training developers. What's the substitute for that?
I don't know. I'm just here to point things out and cause problems. I don't come up with solutions. Geez, basically what it boils down to, that question made me nervous. What it basically boils down to is that's your responsibility. Like as security guys, it's our responsibility to identify problems in their code base and do things like parallel programming. I actually think that Yahoo, I don't know if I can even talk about Yahoo's process, but I think it's actually very, very smart, is that in the groups, in different developer groups, one of the developers is actually considered like a paranoid, like a local person that does the security for them, and they'll look at everybody's code from the security mindset. I think just having something like that, very basic in place, actually helps out a lot. I have no idea because I've never seen Yahoo's metrics. There's people I could talk to afterwards that could tell me that, but I think that's actually an extremely interesting concept of taking a developer and saying it's your responsibility to look at the code base, and then having somebody else be like the performance engineer, but it's their job to look at the code from a performance standpoint, right? I think that that's a very smart way to go about doing it. Doesn't it require what? Oh, training developers? You'd be surprised how many developers actually understand very, very basic security things. And pretty much, again, going back to my point, there's pretty much one thing that you need to do as a security person, and that's make sure your data is validated, is valid. Like that'll solve 95% of your problems. Yeah.
One of the things you brought up with that process
Yeah.
was if you don't get the results you expect, you'll have to determine if you're measuring the right thing.
That's right.
Couldn't it be that what you're doing, the stuff you're doing is wrong?
Yeah, no, it could be.
What's the process for determining which is the problem metric or the metric?
It may be a little of both. So the first thing is whenever you choose to pick a metric, don't choose, like, I'm sure that Facebook did not start off going like, we need to see how many users are going to use us on a daily basis. That is not their first metric they used. Their first metric was, let's get tons of customers every single day. Like, let's just do that. And then as over time, they kind of changed what the metric is that's important, right? Which makes sense, you know. And unfortunately, our metrics are never revenue, right? Increase in revenue. So yeah, you're right. You need to evaluate, am I measuring the right thing, or is what I actually did wrong? Let me try something else. Typically, the problem with doing that is whenever you identify a metric, there is a very, very clear thing of what you need to do in order to get that metric lower or increase or whatever. And so you typically may only have one idea, right? Again, I'm using soft language. I don't know if you caught that. Typically, most of the time. There's a bunch of other ones, yeah.
You put there about 95% forms to go away from validated data.
Uh-huh.
Isn't the point about vulnerability management that They suck because you have to validate the data.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, excellent point. All right, so I have 7 seconds. Thanks, guys. Actually, it looks like by the clock I have 10 minutes. Is that right? Oh, stop now.